So good morning again, everyone. Welcome to the October School of Public Affairs First Friday. Thank you for being here, especially on a cool, foggy, rainy maybe morning. It really is fall, I guess, in Colorado. And I think I can promise that we'll execute better than the Broncos did last night, but sorry about that. Low bar, exactly. So we also have folks on Zoom. We were just trying to get the logistics down here, but thank you again for being here. I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. And as many of you know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary this year of both the University of Colorado, Denver and the School of Public Affairs. And so our themes this year are 50 years of topic X in public affairs. Last month, we talked about population growth, because I think one of the things when you think of Colorado over 50 years, it's a state that's grown a lot and that's shaped a lot of things. And today we're going to talk about politics in particular. First, some logistics. As most of you know, the bathrooms are behind us. You've grabbed some food, hopefully. I want to thank Pam of Goddess Catering, who's providing the food today. She's a woman-owned business, and so it's awesome for her providing the breakfast. She's probably around the corner right now. I also want to thank Tula Wellbrook and back from SPA, Dee Dee Flynn and Joan Fishburne, who helped check you in, and the other SPA folks and our technical support here today for making this work so well. We'll run until 10 o'clock this morning. If you need to leave earlier, we certainly understand that. But if you want to stay longer, we don't get kicked out of the room. And if you want to have conversations, or if there's more coffee or food to have, please continue to stay. Next month in our 50th series, we're focusing on criminal justice and crime issues in Colorado. We have a terrific criminal justice department within the School of Public Affairs, and some of those folks and other panelists will join us. The month after that, we're going to focus on nonprofits in Colorado and how that landscape has evolved over the last 50 years. We also have plans for the spring around public finance in Tabor, and education and health and other issues that we'll get you more specifics about. I think if you were watching the rolling PowerPoints earlier, in addition to other information, we had a land acknowledgement for the fact that we stand on the land of many Native American tribes. I want to acknowledge that acknowledgement. And also the 50th anniversary of CU Denver is an exciting thing for us. It also was associated with displacement of a Hispanic community in this area, of course, and that's something we continue to try to deal with. In fact, Nolbert Chavez, one of our key panelists this morning, is working on the 9th Street project of some of the houses that weren't knocked down on campus, and trying to do more with that. So we appreciate that very much. We will, if you have questions, I think maybe you had the opportunity, or will have the opportunity to get a paper and pen and write them down, and we'll collect those in about 45 minutes, and I'll ask a few of those questions to our panel in addition to the ones we're going to start with. I looked at 50 years ago today, and all these topics we don't have to cover 50 years. Most of us probably weren't living here for 50 years. How many were in Colorado in 1972? Just curious. Okay, well, good. And I was just curious myself. I got here in 2003, looked up the elections in 1972, which were particularly fascinating. Governor John Love, a Republican, was leaving, and Governor John Vanderhoff was elected, and he served, I guess, until Dick Lamb. Actually, as we're going to talk about a little bit, the party politics shifted. Vanderhoff was the last Republican governor, except for Bill Owens, since that time. It was also the election in which the voters rejected the Olympics, and the big New York Times headline that I pulled up on Google was in the Senate race, Floyd Haskell surprisingly beat three-time incumbent Gordon Alsott, which was apparently he had a 30-point lead, which disappeared. This is also the election where Nixon won, right? Like big time over McGovern, not only nationwide, but in Colorado, apparently Nixon won 63%, before Watergate and all of that. The other big thing was Patty Schroeder won a congressional seat at age 32, the first woman from Colorado, one of the first women in the country, and maybe the youngest woman elected to Congress, or certainly one of them. So it was an interesting election 50 years ago. And a lot of things have changed since then, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so we have this terrific panel. Krista Kafer next to me is a columnist for the New York Denver Post, has been an adjunct professor at Regis and other places. She has worked in DC with the Heritage Foundation on education policy and school choice issues. As her bio says, she's traveled a lot and continues to do that. And also, actually, both of our panelists are master's graduates of our own political science department here at CU Denver. So thank you, Krista, for being here. You also, if you watch the Friday night PBS show, Colorado Inside Out, you've probably seen Krista as a panelist on that. To Krista's right is Nolbert Chavez. Nolbert plays a bunch of roles here at the University of Colorado, including Chief of External Initiatives and Executive Director of CityCenter. He's also an elected CU Regent from the 7th District, and as I mentioned earlier, working on the 9th Street project here on campus as well. And Nolbert, in terms of today's panel, also was an elected state legislator in the 1990s, and a lobbyist at the state capitol as well. So he has pretty deep knowledge of the kinds of things we're going to talk about. So thank you for being here. To start off, I asked the panelists if they would, when I first contacted them about 50 years of politics in Colorado, kind of what one or two things, strikes you the most as you think about that, and then we'll dive into some other topics or dive deeper on some of those. But Krista, do you want to start us off with some thoughts on what you think about in that regard? And you've been here 50.
Yeah, I have. So I've been here 52 years, actually.
Okay.
So I remember growing up when Colorado was sort of a light purple in a way. I mean, in the sense that it wasn't super politicized. I remember sitting on the green shag carpet when Pat Schroeder announced her retirement. My parents were conservative, but politics wasn't the kind of hot thing that it is now. Obviously, there was no Twitter, no other kinds of social media. There wasn't the kind of ugly dialogue, not to say that ugly dialogue hasn't happened throughout our history. I have to read some of the things that the founding fathers said to each other was a little on the spicy side, but I just remember things being calmer, maybe more bipartisan, and maybe we always look back on the past and be like, oh, look how bipartisan that was. But it did seem that way. I was looking at some polling or some registration data about, there were more Republicans than Democrats, but Boulder was more liberal, Colorado Springs more conservative, but things generally were a little bit more mellow. It just seems like in the last 20 years, things have gotten a lot more politicized. I do think it's interesting that Colorado, like Utah, a lot of Republicans here are not of the Trumpist brand. I think that's interesting because I went up to Wyoming and it's Trump country. So why is it that Colorado and Utah, both of which have a contingent of sort of, Ron Hanks, Tina Peters types, but generally most of the Republicans are not of that ilk. But if you go north, Colorado is a lot like Wyoming, definitely more urban here. You see a different dynamic. So I do think it's interesting that we've gone from sort of kind of purpley red, but not super political to purple to now I would say blue in the course of my lifetime, with politics becoming a much sharper edged sport.
Thank you, Chris. Nolbert?
Good observations. So I was 26 when I was elected to the State House from House District 5, which is the one we're in now. And there were 24, no, maybe it was 21 Democrats at the time. And so the Republicans held the House, Senate, CU Board of Regents, State Board of Education, every statewide office except one, Roy Romer. Today, it's the exact opposite. So both houses of the legislature, Democrats control all the statewide offices except one, the Board of Regents and the State Board of Education. So the pendulum has swung in terms of elected office all the way back from those days in '94, not 50 years ago, but as far back as my political career goes to where we are today. And the interesting thing, I think, for me is And I also served 4 years before term limits and 4 years after. And so I got to serve with Tilly Bishop and Dottie Wong and Sally Hopper and Paul Schauer and folks that had been around decades. And I would argue they were statesmen. Wayne Knox, right? These were folks, Wayne Knox served 32 years, longest serving representative. And there were many more statesmen who were really interested in the larger good as opposed to their district or their party's particular bent. Hi.
Sorry.
No.
I thought
Thank you.
marijuana, not using it for editing.
And you don't see that anymore. With term limits, all those folks left, and what you seem to get now on both sides of the aisle are folks with an agenda. They're there for at most 8 years in any particular body, and they've got to get something done, and they're there to put their stamp on it. And you also don't see the type of longevity that you did in leadership. So back when I was first elected, you had the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, who would serve 8, 10 years. They were able to offer a measure of control, and if someone was getting out of line, they could step in, whether that was members or lobbyists or staff or others, and they were going to be there longer than you were going to be there. That's not the case anymore. If someone makes it to leadership, it's usually for 2 years, and if they're really lucky, 4 years, and that's it. And so folks that stand on the other side of the glass, they think, I'll be here longer than they're going to be here. And so that is a change. The other change I would offer is that back when I was there, the Republicans were in control of the legislature, and they mainly came from rural parts of the state. And so they had the agenda, their agenda, rural agenda was the agenda of the day. And now that has shifted. It's a more urban agenda because Democrats who are largely from metro areas are in the majority. So the two big contrasts there, and it is a very different place at the state capitol than it was when I started. Just different. I won't say better or worse, but it is very different.
Great, thanks, Nolbert. I meant to earlier acknowledge the fact that we have some students from our accelerated MPA program here, John Ronquillo, their faculty member, and if those students could raise their hands, thank you all for being here, the leaders of the future. I appreciate that. And we've been joined now by Patty Calhoun, and Patty is the editor of Westword. It sounds like she was working on an important project in her day job. So thank you for being able to join us, Patty. And Patty is also a regular on the Friday night Colorado Inside Out politics discussion. And she co-founded Westword in 1977. So not quite 50 years of this in Colorado, but most of that span. So Patty, the first question I put out to Krista and Nolbert was, what one or two things strike you when you think about 50 years of politics in Colorado and what's changed?
Well, among the many exciting editing tasks I was doing this morning is it's the 50th anniversary of Rocky Mountain High and also the 25th anniversary of John Denver's death. And some of you won't remember that, but in the early 70s, the reputation Colorado had around the country for being independent and independent in a really good way, and caring about the environment and caring about the people was strong. I was in college at Cornell when I decided to move purposely to Denver because I thought it was a great city that was much more interesting than the daily papers made it look, which it still is, not that there are that many daily papers. And you think about the fight against the Olympics. You think about Pat Schroeder and all the other people who got into politics. It was a real sea change for this state 50 years ago, and we've led the country in so many different ways. the things we have seen that have really affected things adversely, fewer of those daily newspapers, however boring they were, there is less media. There's less media that gives analytical looks at politics, that gives in-depth looks. We have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have a lot of online journals, but they're not doing a lot of really good journalism. I think that's a problem for us. Term limits is an interesting problem that cuts both ways. As you said, we see some people who would have stayed in city council forever. We see when Denver pushed back on the original term limits passed by the state in 2000, and then we moved it back. We see that maybe 3 terms is too long for some public officials. So you see a lot of changes there. The most gratifying change I see is the continuing emphasis on unaffiliated voters, voters who are concerned that they don't like the 2-party system or that there are problems with maybe the party they were always in, and they're looking for alternatives and willing to look beyond labels. And I think that is always what's been great about Colorado, and it continues to be. So that's the trend I like the best. We are not dedicated to parties.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, that anticipates my next question for all of you, which, yeah, I think when I got here, the state was about 20 years ago, the state was more or less a third Democrat in terms of registration, a third Republican and a third independent. I think independent is now 40% and maybe still growing. So maybe starting with Krista, what do you make of that, and how has that affected our politics?
No, it's really interesting. So I was looking at the note, it's actually 46%. I actually had to double check that. I was like, really, it can't be 46%. I looked at it wrong. Nope, it was 46% are unaffiliated voters. And I looked back over the voter registration over a couple of years about when was that turning point? And it was around 2014. Prior to 2014, you had more Republicans than Democrats and fewer independents than Democrats. So there was that was the case. And then after 2014, you start to see changes where there ends up being more Democrats than Republicans, more unaffiliated than both. And I wonder what's behind that dynamic. Is it the highly partisan, the partisanship issue in which people get turned off? I've been an unaffiliated voter off and on, and I tend to go unaffiliated when I am turned off by the party that I normally hang out with, where they do things that are too partisan, too shrill. Perhaps a top person does not speak for me. I get fed up and I leave the party. I can't speak for the other people who are now unaffiliated, but I have a hunch that there is a turning away or a turning off from some of the more visible and ridiculous elements of both parties.
And I just want to interject before asking Nolbert the same question. Thank you. A lot of the political science research suggests a lot of independents are actually pretty affiliated in their own head with Republicans or Democrats. It's a relatively small percentage that are, swinging back and forth, depending on the issue or the candidate. And I think sometimes we have a bit of a romantic image of the independent as, so smart that they're, picking and choosing among issues. A lot of the research suggests that sometimes they're some of the least involved and least knowledgeable folks. But anyway, there's a lot of different people in that independent category, I think, from what research suggests. So Nolbert, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with Krista. I think it'll ebb and flow depending on what parties do. But I think what's more important is performance, right? That's where we really see where the electorate is, regardless of their party affiliation, and that's also evident in reapportionment and redistricting, which affects us all, and the gamesmanship that is played in that process. And so statewide offices are the only ones left that you can really see where everyone is, obviously, because everyone votes on it. But because in districts, they're carved up with an intention in mind. And so you can draw a district to perform any way you like. And I don't know if we're going to talk about redistricting or not, but so I won't go into it now. But it's an issue. And so the issue of independent, Democrat, Republican is not as important to me as performance. And you can gauge that in many different ways.
Thanks, Patty. Your further thoughts on independents, Democrats, and Republicans?
Well, I'm so sad that you burst my bubble about the noble unaffiliated voters out there. But I don't want to contradict academia, but I still think the fact that people are not necessarily proud of being identified with a political party and signing up for it officially is a good sign that people are willing to, perhaps they might vote that way, but they're also willing to say, I don't like some of the things you're doing, so I'm not officially signing up. So I think that is a good move. I think the fact that, I know it's very controversial, the whole issue of allowing you to vote in a primary if you're unaffiliated, or to switch and vote in the other party's primary. I know it's controversial. I think it's great. I mean, we are paying for these elections. You should be able to vote in a primary, even if you're not registered for the party. In Colorado, as we saw, the Democrats' tactic that worked in some other states didn't work here. You know, the idea of pushing the most conservative whack job candidates in the Republican Party in hopes they would be the contenders in November. It didn't work here in Colorado, and that's also good. And that's another issue I'm sure we'll get into, but the whole dark money campaign, the campaign finance reform and the unexpected consequences of campaign finance reform has really been a major problem with elections. The other thing I wanted to say is, even though I lament the lack of media, I love how much easier it is for a candidate to set up a campaign, because they can set up a website and they can set up Facebook and they can communicate directly. So we can hear more from candidates. We just hope they want to tell us more.
I'm going to add one more thing, is that the sort of disassociation, people disassociating from parties, is part of a broader trend of disassociation. If you've looked at Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone or Coming Apart by Charles Murray, membership in organizations, whether it's union membership, church membership, party membership, a membership in a Lions Club or an Optimist Club, all of that has gone way down. So I think we're seeing a kind of atomization or disassociation that is happening across the board, I think with really kind of bad effect, where you don't have ordinary, decent people involved in a lot of things. What you do end up with is sometimes the most power hungry people that are taking the lead in organizations, and a greater polarization coming from that.
So related to that, as I mentioned last month, we talked about the growth of Colorado and changing demographics, and over 50 years, we've grown from about 3 million to 6 million-ish, and then probably another up to 8 million by 2050. In terms of politics, I think some of that growth, and we had the state demographer, some of it is people moving here, a lot of it from other states, right? And those people could be Doug Bruce from Orange County, California. It could be liberals from Wisconsin or New York or other kinds of places. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on that, and also internal demographic changes, especially a growing Hispanic or Latinx population, and sort of what your thoughts are on how that's shaped Colorado politics. So maybe start with Nolbert.
I was hoping you would say someone else. I guess the piece that is most interesting to me is the changing demographic of the workforce. And if you look at state employment projections, half of the workforce by 2050 will be a workforce of color, people of color, and that is that's unmistakable. It's growing without any effort on anyone's part. I'll give you an example. CU Denver. We, over the last 10 or 15 years, have steadily grown our Latino student population 1 or 2% every single year without much effort or investment in doing so. And so now what you're seeing is all 3 institutions on the Auraria campus are Hispanic serving institutions, minority serving institutions. And that's a trend that is going to continue. And what we should be thinking about is how do we serve our students today and our students of the future in a way that produces the most graduates, right? And how do we do that in a meaningful way instead of thinking, well, let's just do what we've always done and hope that it works for them.
Patty, your thoughts on the changing demographics and how it changes?
Well,
our
if you had the state demographer here, it's interesting because people are moving out too. And one of the questions is, who are the people who are moving out? Are we losing blue collar workers who can't afford to live in Denver, Colorado anymore? Are we losing people who are just don't like the direction the state is going? And I don't think there's been a huge amount of study yet about that. We know that many of the people moving in are rich because they have to be in order to buy a home in Colorado. So I think one of the big things with the demographics, as you see many more young people still coming here, is people will often identify more by their interest, by their ethnicity. So for example, you can't assume all Latinos are going to vote the same way. You can't even assume they're going to like the term Latinx. There's a huge fight over that when we use the term in a headline for a woman who'd been fired from Channel 9 and now has a big national gig. You can't assume it. You can see that, for example, women might be voting more in a group more predictably this in November because of the abortion issue, but you cannot assume that different genders, different ethnicities are going to vote the same way. I do think people are choosing by issue, and that's certainly more common with younger voters. So we're going to be surprised over the next 10 years where we go.
Awesome.
I would love to know what the tipping point was at 2014 in terms of population. We've been getting a large influx of folks. Is that one of the reasons that Colorado has gone more blue? And is it the reason that does it predict that Colorado will become more blue? Most of the people I know who have moved out of the state have moved out because they don't like the direction of the state. They've moved to places like Idaho, South Dakota, South Carolina. I would predict if that is a trend, we will see bluer states getting bluer and we will see red states getting redder for at least a time. And I would predict then that Colorado will probably continue to get bluer until something changes. Nothing is permanent. I mean, there was a time when the whole South was blue and the North was relatively red. There was a time when New York had predictably Republican governors. There was a time when it would have been impossible for Maryland to have a Republican governor, and they've had a Republican governor for the last two, Governor Hogan. So you can't completely predict the future, but I have a hunch it's going to get a little bit bluer, at least for a time.
Can I add one thing, Paul?
Please.
So it's been a few years now. The Washington Post did a piece on shifting demographics throughout the country. And Colorado was, interestingly, the only state west of the Mississippi not on a border that is predicted to grow. And 8 states, if I remember the graphic, 8 states were going to have half the population of the country, and then the next 18 or 20 states were going to have 30%, and then the remainder of the states. So the point of the article was that we're becoming more and more urbanized. But the fact that Colorado was one of those was interesting, given that all the states around us were not predicted to be.
When was that pre-pandemic? Because it would be
yes.
interesting to see how that's
Yes,
changed
it
now.
was. Yeah, good point.
Awesome. Great point. So following up on that, and I appreciate the questions we've got. We'll get to them in a minute from our in-person audience. If there's questions on Zoom, please folks send them in and we'll get them brought up as well. But following up on that, and Nolbert, you mentioned earlier the urban-rural divide, and the country, the world is becoming, of course, increasingly urban. And in the political sense, in the 50-year span we're talking about, it wasn't too much outside of that. The Supreme Court case, Baker versus Carr, in the early 1960s that said that state legislatures should be made up of one person, one vote. In many states, it previously disproportionately represented the rural interests, which is why state capitals were often geared more to rural things, but definitely a shift. And when you look at the growth in the state, it's overwhelmingly on the I-25 corridor, and it doesn't automatically mean that urban dwellers are more liberal, and we have Colorado Springs in that regard. But I'm certainly across the country on so many issues, guns, opioids, all kinds of things. The rural and urban politics seem to be different, and we have a big district in Western Colorado that Lauren Boebert represents, and she's pretty far on the right. And we've got now a contested new congressional district in north of Denver. I'm just curious at your thoughts on the general urban-rural divide in Colorado. Is it worse than in other states? Is it different? How do you feel like that plays out politically? And maybe start with Patty.
I think it's becoming much more, we saw in the legislature, certainly with rural areas being concerned that they're getting short shrift in education and transportation. But as we'll see in 7 and 8, I think it's much more ultra urban versus suburban in a lot of ways, because the issues are so close together on a lot of it. People have moved out of the core city, but they're still close to it. So it's not like you're looking at the Western Slope and District 3 with Adam Frisch and Lauren Boebert. And those are two very polar opposite locations, Aspen and Rifle, and or Silt, I guess, Aspen and Silt. And in 7 and 8, you have people who live very close together and could not be more disparate. But the issues are going to be really interesting. And I don't think it's so much, you can't call 7 and 8 rural. They're much more exurbs now.
Krista, do you want to weigh in?
I think it's interesting. If you look at other states that have a lot of agriculture, Pennsylvania, California, Texas, you've got large cities surrounded by large rural areas. Colorado is kind of unique in that you've got a big part of the state that is rural, the eastern part, a big part of the state that is western, that is also rural. And then all of the cities, for the most part, with the exception of Grand Junction, are right down the center of the state along the I-25 corridor. That's an interesting dynamic where your main population is along here. I do think that there is a feeling among the rural population that corridor is better represented in our government, whether it's things like water, for example, very contested issue, an issue that is looked at differently, whether you're in agriculture or whether you're in the city. One sort of that kind of crystallizes the cultural differences would be the meat out controversy from a year ago. If you remember, the governor said, let's not eat meat on a particular day. A certain columnist wrote a scathing, sarcastic column about it. And a lot of people in the state that are part of agriculture were sort of deeply offended by that. Like, why? Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to produce. This is a big industry for this state, and you're sort of treating us like we're making a problematic contribution as opposed to feeding people. And it ended up being a kind of, a tempest in a teapot, a sort of silly thing. But I also think that it shows that there are cultural differences and a kind of resentment when people who make their living on the land are so discounted by our urban government.
Nolbert?
I agree with that. That was actually fun to watch. It reminded me of seeing a governor say, "Don't eat Pueblo chili," right? I mean, that would be
Horrible.
the other terrible thing for somebody to say. But if you look, and you mentioned, Patty, CD 7 and 8. I'm elected in CD 7, an old CD 7, right? The previous CD 7 that Ed Perlmutter represented for many, many years. It's very, very different now. And I would argue much more rural than it used to be. It was a suburban district, and now it's sort of 50-50. I mean, Leadville and the Wet Mountains, and it's in addition to Lakewood and parts of Jeffco. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that comes together. And since it's a new district, although the performance is D+5 or whatever it is projected to be. I mean, we'll see what that turns out. The 8th district, again, I don't know what, I have strong opinions about this. So let me try to back up a little bit. I don't know what the heck they were thinking to throw everything into the 8th. Let's make it a 50-50 district, largely Latino district, rural suburban district. I mean, it was the catch-all, it seems to me, and all under the idea that they were going to all of a sudden create competitive seats. They didn't really create any more competitive seats, if you ask me. They made many of them more Democrat or more Republican. The 2nd congressional district didn't need to be more Democrat. The 1st CD didn't need to be, or the 3rd, more Republican. But they did that anyway. So we'll see how 7 and 8 play out. I think those are the most interesting races to watch. The governor's race doesn't seem to be shaping up as a very contested race. So that's, I think, where all the action's going to be.
Awesome. You know, in most of these things that we talk about in politics, it's all sort of relative, right? And Colorado is one of 50 states, and we know we have a pretty polarized country right now, and you know, some of that is around former President Trump, but also other things and other issues. And so I'm curious. And Krista had started her original comments talking about, you know, we were lighter purple. It seemed less polarized back in the good old days, if there were the good old days, 50 years ago. And so I'm curious, in comparing Colorado in your mind to the rest of the country, how these issues of polarization and people not talking across parties, are we in better shape than in other states? Are we in worse? Are we kind of in the middle? And what do you see happening there? So maybe Krista, do you mind starting with that one?
Can I make Patty start? I don't know how to compare, in a sense that I lived in Maryland for 9 years, and Maryland is it's kind of similar rural city divide, with Baltimore and PG County being heavily Democratic and then the rural part of the state being Republican. But here's the funny thing. I remember I was a congressional staffer, so I was working in DC, living in Maryland, and back then, this was under the Clinton administration, obviously some rancor there, but all of the spending bills got passed. The word omnibus didn't exist. All 13 appropriations bills were passed. There were 0 shutdowns. People actually worked together. You think about welfare reform, that was a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. People actually worked together. Staffers knew each other. We drank beer together. Probably too much beer. But the fact is that it wasn't the kind of dysfunction that is now. And I'm not saying it was perfect, but it is interesting that, at least at the Capitol, where I have some memories and experience, that hardcore partisanship did not exist when I was there. It exists very heavily now. And I think it also exists very strongly here in this state.
You know, I'll echo that at the state level, because when I was a newly minted legislator, I can remember so many of the folks I mentioned earlier that had been around a long time, Democrat and Republican, that were there to help you figure it out. And they were there to, their mindset was, you're a part of the House, so we want you to be good at it. Now it's, you don't have that. And your party, your caucus is going to be the only ones you talk to, for the most part, to get your feet on stable footing. It is more partisan in many ways, and less collegial. Amendment 41 changed a lot of that, and there were certainly abuses. There were folks that went out and partied every single night, which was probably bad, but at least they got to know each other, right? Folks got to know each other. It didn't matter what side of the aisle you were on. You were able to.
What Amendment 41?
Huh?
Can you remind us?
I'm sorry, Amendment 41 is the prohibition that elected officials can't receive anything of value. basically. And that especially applied to lobbyists.
No more beer with Krista.
No
No beer.
Krista. And so prior to that, folks really got together and got to know each other under those circumstances. And when that prohibition came in, everyone went to their side of the room, and they don't meet like they used to and get to know each other and come up with solutions that really made sense for everyone.
Patty, your thoughts?
Well, I hate sounding like Little Mary Sunshine on such a gloomy day, but I do see some bright spots in Colorado that I do not see as much in the rest of the country. When Westword started, we were considered an alternative newspaper, and their papers like Westword started around the country. And I would talk to those other editors, and it was pretty easy if you were in Salt Lake City or in Texas to see what you were an alternative to, which was generally very hidebound, scary thinking. Here in Colorado, what we've always found is our readers kind of cut across bases. That in Colorado, it's much more issues and interests than it is going to be party and blind loyalty to it. And it's fun to see that people are willing to at least consider other things. We sit down on Colorado Inside Out, completely disagree with each other, but usually can still chat the next day. We don't know yet we filmed last night, so it's hard to know now who's still talking. But I look at some other bright spots, like look at the Secretary of State's office, which we cannot exactly say Jennifer Griswold is mild-mannered. We've had Tina Peters on the other side, but you also see Wayne Williams, who lost his seat to Griswold, who has gone out with her and working with the state and gone to Mesa County and said, we've got a great system and we're working together. And you see these people, maybe they're rare shining spots, but they are willing to work across and work for the good of the state and what they believe is the good of the state rather than blind allegiance to parties. So I think in Colorado, we are willing to disagree and still have a beer with each other sometime.
Awesome. Or legalize marijuana. So thank you. You've been admirably concise so far. So we've gotten through most of my questions. We have a lot of good questions here. I have a few more. I want to shift a little bit to, we've been talking about, the electorate and Democrats and Republicans and partisanship and bipartisanship, but we also in Colorado, I think, the rules of the game are important anywhere, right? In terms of who gets to vote. You mentioned earlier, Patty, the independents, we agreed in a ballot to allow to vote in the Democratic or the Republican primaries. We put a lot of things on the ballot, period. That's a relatively easy process. I mean, not simple, but easier than in most other states. We have a lot of stuff in the Constitution, probably too much, probably too many contradictions, but we also have a lot of, I think, great processes. I mean, I lived in New York City for many years. Voting was really hard. You'd go and there'd be huge lines, the machines would break, the very well-meaning 70 and 80-year-olds that were the poll watchers, couldn't fix the machines necessarily, and it was hard. And here it's so incredibly easy. It just boggles my mind, except for the politicization of voting, that why other states don't do what we do. We've been second in turnout, and so, but a lot of other processes, right? Nolbert raised redistricting. I want to dig into that a little bit, but we also there have an independent commission that, unlike a lot of other states, it's heavily politicized, and they end up with a kind of ridiculous ratio of Democrats to Republicans or vice versa, given a 50-50 sort of population split. And so I'm curious your thoughts on the processes that we have. How are they as good as I'm saying they are in most cases? Are there some areas where there's still problems around voting, around counting the votes, around who gets to vote, around the districts themselves and all of those processes? And that's a big question, but take whatever piece of it you want to start with, and maybe this time we will start with Patty.
Well, you brought up initiatives. I know that politicians and the people who have to pay for the campaigns often hate these citizen initiatives. I love them as long as you really educate yourselves and the voters educate them. But it does give you a feeling of having some power, some say in how the state is run. And even the ones referred, say, by city council or by the legislature, it's the reason we have the independent redistricting, that the voters agreed it was too political, that there should be these independent commissions. And periodically you see, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, the push to reduce the number of, increase the number of signatures needed to get things on the ballot, or add new rules and restrictions on how people can sign. And some of them have been reasonable, some of them have not, but I like it that we're going to sit down and have 11 things to vote on besides the candidates in the state. And we're going to have, I think, 6 in Denver. And you just hope voters educate themselves. But I like it that you still have the semblance of a feeling as a citizen that you can make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm going to take the opposite stance of Patty.
Okay.
I hate the initiative process. I would get rid of it. I would get rid of all of the populist measures that we have. I would get rid of term limits. I would get rid of Amendment 41. I would get rid of arbitrary low limits on political contributions, because I think all of those things really hurt. I didn't even get rid of Tabor, and I'm saying it on tape, which means I will never get elected as a Republican. And the reason why is that in a representative democracy, we vote for people who then represent us. They have to compromise with each other. They have to weigh the costs and the benefits of different things. They have to consider what is this cost? What do I want to do? Can I vote for this tax increase? Will I still get elected next time? What about this new program? Is it too expensive? Can we afford it? They're forced to do that. Now, it's imperfect. Nothing that human beings do is perfect, but stuck together. And they luckily, if there's no term limits, people have relationships. They're not out for the next, Twitter going viral statement that they make. They're there to do hard work, and they do that hard work, however imperfectly. All of these things that we've now added, and the referendum process is at least 100 years old, so that's not a new thing. But the fact that it's increasingly used to circumvent the process. I'm not saying that voters can't weigh costs and benefits, but I feel that they're not forced to. At least in that legislative room, you have to weigh those things. You have to weigh those things. With the voter, you can say, hey, look at this shiny thing. Do you want it? Sure. Well, what is it going to cost? And then you get these contradictory things like, yes, we want more education funding. Oh, but we don't want any tax increases. Well, you can't have one without the other without having some kind of contradiction. I also think that it separates the accountability away from the legislators. If I know that my person that I'm voting for can't raise my taxes, then I can't appraise his or her opinion on that. It doesn't matter. And part of the power of having all of these things together is if I'm a legislator, I would have to take a stance on tax increases. I would have to take a stance on spending, and I would have to be accountable for those things. And I would actually suggest, and I would love for, say, a political scientist to look into it, that the fact that the Republican Party has suffered in the state may have something to do with Tabor. Because in other states, when taxes get too high, Democrats are voted out of office. Here, that can't happen. And so I actually think the very thing that Republicans pushed under Doug Bruce may have come back to bite them. Again, I know I'm never going to get elected, but there you go.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think Patty's comment and yours kind of lay out the pros and cons very nicely of the initiative process. And so Nolbert, do you want to talk about that or redistricting? Or?
I'll talk about that for a second, and I'll take the middle ground. Because if you think about it, all of those processes are on the surface neutral. It's good on one hand, it's bad on another, depending on who's sort of manipulating it and abusing it, in those instances. And so it's when those things are taken advantage of that we see, a backlash of folks, and we see a combination of voter initiated and passed ballot measures that affect and constrict the state budget process. So if you look at the state budget process, 95% of the budget is caseload driven and driven by Tabor and Amendment 23, which is K-12 funding requirements and others, Arvis-Kelberg. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room in the state budget. It's tied to hands of legislators in terms of being able to make decisions because of contradictory kinds of things that have made it on the ballot and are pulling at each other instead of pushing or pulling together. And so they're neutral in and of themselves. It depends on how they're used over time.
It does make you wonder what was in Colorado's water in 1992 when you had both the hate state vote and Tabor. And you wonder what would have happened if neither of those had happened.
No, those are great questions. I have one more question, and then we have a bunch from our online Zoom and from the audience. So the election coming up next month, and I guess we've already got the blue books, and we'll get the ballot soon, right? At least in my mind, because it's a presidential midterm, and the Democrats control in Washington, usually that's a big swing against the presidential party. Also, you add inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the nuclear weapons concerns, just pulling out of Afghanistan. It feels like there's a lot of headwinds against the Democrats. At the same time, in Colorado, we've been blue the last couple of cycles, are we still purple? And do the Republicans need to win some statewide offices and make some gains in this election, or if the Democrats hold most of the state political offices, are we really blue? And is that true for a while? And I know that's a tough question, and we all don't have crystal balls, but maybe we'll start with Patty on your thoughts on that.
Well, one of the things that makes all these predictions so difficult now is because you can vote early. It used to be you could just time everything for that second Tuesday in November. And now it is becoming really tricky because what could happen in the Ukraine? What could happen with inflation? What Joe Biden just did a marijuana pardon, but we're still a month out. Will that make that much difference? I think we will certainly see a swing towards the Republicans around the country. I don't think it'll be that strong here in Colorado. I think we'll have at least one statewide office, and I'm not talking about the CU regions, go Republican, probably the Secretary of State, maybe Treasurer. But I think here it will not. It'll be close, I think, in the State House, but I think it'll stay blue.
Okay, thank you. Nolbert?
As I said earlier, I think you're going to see the targeted effects of where we really are in the 8th district, to smaller degree in the 7th. Because Polis is fairly popular, I don't think that is going to be indicative of really where the state may or may not be. And the same with Bennett. You'll see it in the state house races and Senate races. I think because Kevin Priola switched parties, Senator Priola from Republican to Democrat, it's going to make it harder for Republicans to take this state Senate. I think that had that not happened, I think that would have been a sign of us moving a little more red and to have a split legislature. That's what so many folks really prefer to see is an opportunity for both sides to have a voice in their state policy. So a split legislature is something that Polis would probably love, but many others would also welcome. I think that'll be made a little harder now. I don't think you'll see the House flip. They've got way too many seats that they would have to lose in order for that to happen. So I think we're going to really only see it on the margins in a few select races where the state really is.
Okay, great. Thank you. Krista?
So I think if there is a red wave, it'll be a purple trickle here. It's a tough state. Now, that doesn't say that Republicans can't win. Think about even in other blue states, Massachusetts, Maryland, both had Republican governors. It is possible here, but you have to run a perfect campaign. And there's another problem here is that there is a contingent. It's a minority contingent, but a strong contingent in the Republican Party, which is still wrapped up in conspiracy theories and Trump stuff. What do you do as a candidate with those people? Do you ignore them? Do you cultivate them? Do you placate them? What do you do? Because you can't afford to not get their vote. You have to get, if you're a Republican candidate in the state for statewide, you have to get all of the Republicans and some independents, and if you're lucky, a few Democrats. So what do you do with that contingent? And I think we've seen each of those statewide candidates approach that a little bit differently, but it makes it very difficult. And I think until the conspiracy theory, Mike Lindell, Tina Peters people, until that virus is cured, they're not viruses, I'm not calling that, but the conspiracy theory virus, until that runs its course, Republicans are going to have a much harder time winning in this state.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move to the questions that we got online and in person, and honoring the folks on Zoom. I'll start with one of those, and I'll pose it to one of you, but please jump in with your thoughts if you want to add. So Nolbert, maybe there's a question about the changes in the politics of views on immigration over the last 50 years in Colorado and how you've seen that change.
That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that, actually. It hasn't been something that I've really followed, immigration policy at the state level. And we certainly don't see it like you do in border states where it's topic of every conversation. I remember before my time in the legislature when Rich Castro argued, let's put a wall at the southern border of Colorado, or somebody did. Now I'm forgetting how the story went, but there was uproar about that. But it hasn't been an issue that I've really followed, to be honest.
Yeah, well, and I invite others. I mean, it seems like the kind of issue that's gone up and down. I mean, we've kind of demonized immigrants at some points in time and want to minimize the number coming across the border. Other times, when the economy is different, maybe we need their
on
work.
That point, thank you for broadening that a little bit, because on that point, dreamers and how the state has dealt with and allowed for students to receive in-state tuition. That was a huge change, so I'm thinking of it less in terms of immigration necessarily in terms of folks coming to Colorado, but the students that we had here already that grew up here. And if you recall that debate, Stephen Jordan really, he deserves a lot of credit, because during that debate, he alone, and he was the president of Metro at the time, he alone went down to the Capitol and took everyone on. And he and everyone else in higher ed sat back and watched the fireworks, but he took everyone on, and that was not an easy feat. And he said, you know what, this is the right thing to do. My board of trustees supports it, and we're going to offer in-state tuition to undocumented students. And that was a thing of beauty, in my opinion, to see someone stand up to the legislature and do that. It eventually passed, and now it's commonplace. But at the time, it was not an easy conversation to have, and he did it by himself.
And
Thanks,
to piggyback off
Yeah.
that a little bit, so Colorado, I think, has dealt with the realities of the immigration policy, the nitty gritty. So you also have in Denver, so in addition to the tuition, you have Denver, for example, giving business licenses to undocumented dreamers, because otherwise, how are they going to be out there? We just ran an essay about one of them who's got a food truck and is doing great things, but these would be kids with no chances otherwise. So we are dealing with the realities that were put upon us, not by our own policies.
I'll also note Steve, with pride, Steve Jordan is a SPA PhD alum, so we're proud of that. The next question is a fairly specific one, and I'll put it to Krista. You said that 46% of voters in Colorado are registered as independent. Do we have data on how this compares to the other 49 states? And
That is a great
we
question.
could Google that, I suppose.
That I have no answer to. But that is a great question.
I think it's on the high side, right? I mean, my sense is
I think
we
it's on
have
the
more
high side.
independence than most states, but yeah, we'll figure that out and put that up on our website somewhere, but it's a pretty specific one. Let's see, this is a question. It says, what was the election of Lauren Boebert surprising? And I'll maybe broaden that to, because she's in the race where at least Adam Frisch released a poll that made it sound closer than I think any of us might have thought. I don't know. Patty, do you want to?
Her initial election was not so surprising, just partly because I think Tipton wasn't really paying attention. Look at all the weird things that have happened in that district, McGinnis and others recently. I think people were just kind of asleep at the wheel. And Lauren Boebert, if you don't actually listen to her, is a fairly interesting person. You know, she's a mom, she's an entrepreneur. She likes, you know, she supports the Second Amendment. On paper, she can look pretty good. You just don't want to listen to her. So the fact that she kind of snuck past in the primary wasn't a surprise. She was much more dynamic in the campaign than her competitor. So these things sometimes happen in Colorado. It's like Tabor going through with Doug Bruce, but it will be interesting if Adam Frisch, and that is his poll, so it's a little tougher to believe it, but maybe people will be tired of it. You know, it's been fun for 2 years, but that's enough.
Krista, do you want to?
Some people like that style. I think it's awful. But I think there are people out there that want somebody who is quote unquote a fighter. And I guess for them, you know, putting out bombastic tweets is fighting, or it gives them a sense that they're being represented, someone's fighting on their behalf. And they like that style, that sort of Trumpian style, over someone like a Tipton, who was very much a statesman. I think she'll win her election. I would hope that time in office might temper her. Yeah, not yet. Yeah, I guess if I was a betting woman, I wouldn't put any cash there. But it is interesting, and you know, there've always been firebrands in Congress. And you know, she did make a good burger. I will say that. I once had one of her burgers. You can say something nice about everyone.
So I don't believe the poll. I think if that poll were really accurate or trend, the DCCC would be spending a lot more money than they are, which is probably none in that seat. So in that race. So I don't think it's an accurate. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen anything that supports that. And you're right. The third has kind of gone up and down. Scott McGinnis and John Salazar, and then Tipton, and now her. Brings me back to redistricting. They made that district more partisan, more Republican, and so I can't imagine a Democrat unseating her given the performance of that district, unless it's in a primary.
So another question, many young people worry about the future given the state of the climate. So do you see Colorado leaders taking enough action to be helpful on that issue before it's too late? Obviously, climate's a global issue and Colorado has limited tools, but how do you see our politics shaping environmental issues? And Patty, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I mean, you see it with some of the initiatives that the city of Denver has taken on. You see it in policies, sometimes backtracking, but certainly climate change is one of the issues that people seem to think they really care about. I will tell you this, every time we write an environmental story, you can see the traffic drop. So people, they like the topic in theory, they don't want to hear about it.
Other thoughts on the politics climate link in Colorado?
You know, I think that there's a lot of work being done on water. In terms of, we've done a lot of water conservation at the urban level, and we're going to need to start seeing some conservation at the agricultural level where 89% of our water is used. I would also like to see, 50% of our power comes from coal in this state. Some of it's renewables, but we need another sort of powerhouse because you can't do everything on solar panels and wind. You have to have either coal, nuclear, or natural gas as your sort of main thing when these other things are not producing. I would like to see our coal plants be changed over to natural gas, and I think that's very doable. It's also, they require a lot less water than coal plants. So I'm hoping, and I know that a lot of our leaders are doing this sort of technical work on energy acquisition. It's not pretty. You write an article about it, nobody wants to read it, but I do know that behind the scenes, there's work being done.
And I'll say, there was a saying that I first heard at the Capitol: whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, right? And that is really an issue that legislators think a lot about, but most of us on the Front Range, especially where development is happening in a widespread way, we're really not thinking about water in a way that we need to be. And if you think about Douglas County, and they're all built on a finite water source. That's scary. That's scary. So I think we do need to do more on it. And the lawsuit that was recently in the headlines, all the states said basically, you guys need to curb your water consumption, not us. We all have a part to play in that, and we're not doing it. We're not doing it.
Great, thank you. One last question from the audience, and it's a very wonky one, which I appreciate in the academic setting. Do you believe that ranked choice voting is feasible in Colorado, given the high percentage of independents? And to give you a minute to think about that, I mean, you know probably that New York, Maine, California, in various ways have been experimenting with different kinds of elections that don't end up with a Democrat and a Republican necessarily facing each other on a 51% vote in the final tally. They're complicated, some of them more so than others. The New York City one, I think, took a while to figure out, right, who's in second place and how those votes add up. But what are your thoughts on kind of experimenting with the voting rules in Colorado, or should we watch what happens elsewhere?
I'll start. I don't like any of those ideas because they're artificial ways of doing what we should be able to do already. So if you think about the two-party system, people don't like the two-party system, so let's change it to something else. It'll create a whole different set of issues rather than solving the initial problem to begin with. So term limits, same thing. You could vote people out. People just didn't do it. And so now we need to have an artificial, now some of it's good. So I don't want to say term limits is bad. People would tell me when I was leaving the legislature being term limited, oh my God, isn't it horrible? You're going to be term limited. I'd say, yeah, but you're getting rid of Mark Pascal too. So, it's a double-edged sword. I just think it's an artificial way of doing what folks can and should be doing on their own.
I'm with him.
Yeah. As am I, but here's an example. So Denver's mayor's race, it's nonpartisan. So that's not fixing that issue. I ran into a mayoral candidate last night, and we could have 12, 15 of them before we're done. The headache of the ranked choice voting, you still have to play the odds just to get into the runoff, but still you've got an option then finally between the two. I don't love ranked choice.
Okay. Great, thank you. So we're almost up against time. One last big thought in a short time for all of you. Either something we've missed about in the conversation so far, or when we're having this panel 50 years from now and we're celebrating CU Denver's 100th anniversary. Maybe not all of us the same people, but what will be the thoughts about Colorado politics over the near future, or if that one's too weird, it just, what other topic do you want to reinforce that we've talked about already? And I'll start with Krista.
I was thinking I'll be 102,
All right.
So I'm not sure what I'll be thinking about, but and nothing's ever as bad as it seems. It's very easy, particularly for young people, to say things are so bad right now, but I remember when you couldn't get really good food here in Denver. There was like a Chinese restaurant, an Italian restaurant, and a whole bunch of diners. And now you can get Indian food. So, and culinary isn't everything, but it is most of life. So, but there is still a lot of really positive things. Denver is an amazing city with great cultural centers and different things. And so I think it's good that we hash these things out. But in the end, life is better now.
Awesome. So our next topic needs to be 50 years of food in Colorado. Nolbert.
I have no clue what 50 years from now will be like, but I hope it is as collegial as I remember. I'm thinking back to the good old days as well of when I was first introduced to politics at the state level. It was wonderful to work with, and I think back fondly often of the folks that I was able to serve with, from both parties, and that I haven't seen in a long time, and so I hope that we come back to that at some point.
Great. Thank you. Patty, last word.
Well, I hope 50 years from now, I'm not editing stories at 5 a.m. about marijuana. But assuming that doesn't happen, I would like to see, and I would hope we do see it from younger people getting involved, moving to Colorado, to get the spirits we had in 72, 74. I mean, what Colorado did by rejecting the Olympics. And I think a smart Olympics policy might still pass here. You certainly see boosters trying to bring it back again, but people wanted to know who profited from that, who paid, who profited, which are still 50 years later, the questions we should be asking about almost every policy. And I think Coloradans ask them, and that's important.
Those are awesome answers. Thank you so much. So please join me in thanking our panel for great comments.